The film kicks off with three friends, Alicia, Daniel, and Chris, driving down a quiet road on their way to a hiking trip. Everyone's in a fairly good mood, but soon Daniel asks them to pull over because he needs to take a leak. While he's away in the bushes, the air in the car feels a little heavier. Chris looks at Alicia and quietly wonders if they should finally tell Daniel what happened between them. That little fling they had behind his back. Alicia quickly shuts the idea down, insisting it's best if he never finds out. Chris isn't so sure, but before they can argue further, Daniel strolls back like nothing happened, and the trip continues. They eventually arrive at this isolated area that Daniel describes in almost a spooky tone. He says the place used to be a war zone filled with landmines, traps, bombs, basically a death field. It sets a weird atmosphere for the hike, but the three keep going anyway and climb to the top of a rocky outcrop. Out of nowhere, Daniel announces that Chris should marry Alicia. Chris is floored. He has no idea how to respond. Daniel insists, though, saying that he wanted his best friend there when he popped the question. After some hesitation, Chris gives in, proposes, and Alicia accepts. But Chris's reaction is lukewarm at best. He says he has to leave for a bit, and when Daniel questions why he looks so uneasy, Chris brushes it off. That night, they're sitting around a fire and Daniel presses again, asking why Chris didn't look happy proposing. Chris just avoids the question, and Daniel tries to reassure him things will work themselves out. They all end up going through with some vow-sharing stuff, after which Alicia and Daniel retreat into their tent, leaving Chris to sit nearby, looking pretty miserable. The next morning, Chris wakes up and spots a stranger rummaging through their stuff. Instinctively, he lunges at the man, ready to fight, but the guy quickly says his name is DV and he's with Daniel and Alicia. Chris doesn't buy it. He's convinced DV's trying to rob them. Luckily, Alicia and Daniel show up and calm the situation, defending DV. Chris reluctantly apologizes, and DV explains he only wanted Alicia's camera to take a group picture for them. Once he has it, he sets them up to pose, directing where they should stand. But then disaster strikes. Chris unknowingly steps onto something buried in the ground. DV's face drops, and he whispers that Chris has stepped on a landmine. If Chris lifts his foot, they all die. Everyone is stunned into silence. But DV instructs Daniel and Alicia to take cover behind a nearby rock in case the mine goes off. Daniel begs DV to go get help, but the man warns it'll take at least 4 hours to reach town, and by then it might be too late. Eventually, they agree to let DV leave, and Daniel tells Chris to stay calm and completely still. Alicia hides behind a rock, and after some time, Daniel goes to join her. His phone buzzes, and the two walk further to try to catch a signal. Alicia overhears him saying someone on the other end couldn't help them. Shocked, she demands to know what's going on. When they return to Chris, she blurts out that she had meant to tell Daniel about her fling with Chris, but panicked when he proposed. Daniel, however, calmly reveals he already knew, and that this entire setup was intentional. The landmine accident wasn't luck at all. It was DV's idea to expose Chris. Daniel even pulls out a shovel and tosses it near Chris, suggesting Alicia dig a trench so Chris could try to leap off the mine. But Daniel admits the plan might not work. He also confesses that the phone call was faked. There's no service here. Everything had been staged from the start. Chris nervously asks if the landmine is even real. Daniel yanks a chain from it and tosses it aside, coldly saying he just armed it. So if Chris moves now, boom, end of story. Daniel then walks off, meeting DV a distance away. Turns out DV never actually went to town, but stayed nearby to watch the chaos unfold. Daniel convinces him to quit watching and head off to a club instead. The two leave, abandoning Alicia and Chris. Alicia eventually finds the chain Daniel threw aside and tries to reattach it to the mine. She manages to secure it a little, but isn't confident it'll hold. She tells Chris not to risk stepping off and shifts to a backup plan, digging. While she's working, a man named Ilia shows up with his dog. The dog runs toward Chris, and Alicia panics, swinging the shovel to scare it away. Ilia mistakes this for her trying to hurt his dog and pulls a gun on them. He orders Chris to move, but Alicia desperately explains he can't because of the mine. Ilia doesn't fully believe her at first, accusing them of burying something since he saw her digging. After Alicia's repeated explanations, he begins to accept the truth. Ilia asks how he can help, and Alicia hands him a shovel, begging him to keep digging while she fetches water. While she's gone, Ilia tests their story by throwing a stone at Chris, hoping to see if he flinches. Chris gets furious, and when Alicia returns, she's just as angry. Ilia shrugs it off, saying he wanted proof they weren't lying. Satisfied now, he asks how the hell they ended up in this mess. Alicia hesitates, but finally spills the story. Instead of sympathy, Ilia mocks her, calling her a slut. Chris snaps at him, saying he should just leave if he isn't going to help. Ilia says he will help, but only if he gets something in return. Alicia reluctantly offers him the stuff in her backpack. He rifles through it, but tosses it aside, saying he's not interested in those things. What he really wants is the clothes Alicia's wearing. Both Chris and Alicia flat out refuse, but Ilia insists that's the price for his help. Chris tries to bribe him with money, but Ilia refuses, saying cash means nothing to him. At this point, Chris loses hope. He tells Alicia maybe it's better if he just steps off the landmine, gambling on the chance that she reattached the chain properly. The situation only kept spiraling darker. At one point, Alicia tried to comfort Chris by telling him that the chain she reattached on the landmine might have actually worked. Chris clung to that small hope, only for Alicia to later admit she lied just to calm him down. That crushed him, but there wasn't time to argue. Things were getting worse by the second. Ilia finally got what he wanted out of Alicia. Humiliated, she gave in, and he half-heartedly started to dig. But instead of helping seriously, he barely scratched at the dirt before suddenly pausing, distracted. From a small radio clipped on his belt came a voice. Chris and Alicia were stunned. All this time, Ilia had a way to contact the outside world, yet he hadn't used it to get help. Furious, Alicia begged him to hand the radio over so she could plead for assistance. But Ilia wasn't about to just hand it to her. He twisted the situation, smirking as he told her she'd need to crawl like a dog and fetch her underwear before he'd even consider giving it up. Chris exploded with anger, hurling insults at Ilia, but the man barely flinched. Alicia, desperate for any chance of survival, swallowed her pride and did as he demanded. Once she had the radio, she called frantically for help, but the voice on the other end spoke a language she didn't understand. Again, she turned to Ilia, begging him to translate. He leaned back and said he would, but only if she stripped off a piece of clothing for every word he translated. He called it a game. Chris's fury boiled over, but Alicia, cornered and terrified, eventually removed an item of clothing. Ilia smirked, translated, and confirmed the man on the radio didn't seem to understand her anyway. He deliberately kept her locked in this twisted cycle, demanding more and more payment for his translations. Chris snapped, spitting a vicious curse at Ilia's mother. That got Ilia's attention. He whipped out his gun, pointing it at Chris, and then released his dog to go after Alicia. Dropping the weapon, he chased her himself. Chris seized the opportunity, grabbing Ilia's gun. But it wasn't enough. Ilia came back with a knife pressed to Alicia's throat. He nicked her skin just to show he meant it. Chris, armed yet helpless, froze. If he pulled the trigger, Ilia would still have time to slit her throat. Ilia then forced Chris to do the unthinkable, call Alicia a vile name. With tears running down her face, she begged him not to, but with her life dangling by a thread, Chris said the word. That wasn't enough for Ilia. He dragged Alicia behind a rock and assaulted her, while Chris, still standing on the mine, was powerless to stop it. At last, Chris decided he couldn't take it anymore. He aimed and fired, but just as he pulled the trigger, Ilia's dog lunged, knocking Chris off balance. Instead of hitting Ilia, the bullet went wide, and Chris fell into the ditch Alicia had been digging. He blacked out. When he came to, Alicia was lying beside him, gravely wounded. Ilia stood over them, coldly admitting the landmine had been fake all along. Real ones go off the second you step on them, he said, mocking their ordeal. Their so-called friend, Daniel, had staged the entire trap. Then Ilia walked away with his dog, leaving Chris with Alicia's limp body. Chris screamed for help, but nobody came. Time passed, and Chris resurfaced miles away, stumbling across two women, Tanya and Ilia. Exhausted, he claimed he was lost and asked for directions. The women, kind and unaware of who he really was, gave him a map and even pointed him toward where he needed to go. Playing the part of a helpless wanderer, Chris asked if he could stay and share a meal. They agreed. Just then, Ilia reappeared because the house Chris had stumbled into belonged to him. Tanya was his wife and Ilia his daughter. The air turned tense instantly. Ilia recognized Chris immediately, but Chris pretended not to know him. Ilia demanded he leave, but Chris insisted he was just finishing his meal. Tanya and Ilia looked confused but uneasy, sensing something was off. Eventually, Chris left, thanking Tanya as though nothing had happened. Ilia followed, confronting him outside. He warned Chris to leave his family alone and suggested they meet somewhere private in an hour to settle things. Chris appeared to agree and walked away. Ilia, however, released his dog to follow Chris, and then retreated back inside. But when the dog failed to return, Ilia grew suspicious. Meanwhile, Chris dragged the dog's bloody body back to Ilia's home, laying it out like a twisted message. Ilia rushed back, saw the scene, and panicked. Grabbing his gun, he tried to confront Chris, but the gun was empty. Chris turned the tables, shooting Ilia in the legs just as Tanya and Lika arrived, horrified. Chris forced them to drag Ilia inside. Once inside, Chris's cruelty surfaced. He ordered Lika to tie up her own mother. Tanya pleaded, offering Chris money to leave, but he sneered, saying he didn't want cash. He wanted something else entirely. With Ilia bleeding on the floor, Chris mocked him, pouring wine over his wound and forcing his family to watch. He demanded Lika's underwear, and when Ilia tried to stop it, Chris stuffed the garment into his mouth, warning him not to spit out. Chris then retold the story of Alicia, how Ilia had left her die, how Chris had discovered Ilia's home using his lost wallet. Tanya and Lika listened in horror. Then Chris announced they were going to play a final game. He loaded one bullet into his gun and spun the chamber. Russian roulette, but with Lika as the target. He ordered her to strip with every pull of the trigger. Ilia begged Chris to take him instead, but Chris refused. Lika, terrified and crying, obeyed. Piece by piece, she undressed until Chris aimed the gun at her head. He pulled the trigger, and a single bullet fired. She dropped instantly, dead before hitting the ground. Tanya screamed, Ilia sobbed, and Chris just sat back, staring emptily at what he had done. The game was over, but there was no satisfaction in his eyes. He curled up against the wall, broken and hollow. And that's where the story ends, dark, cruel, and haunting.